So good morning, everybody. My name is Daniel Foster. I'm a policy analyst at the Atkinson Center. I'm also a part-time professor in the School of Early Childhood at George Brown College. And welcome to this panel on addressing bias in early childhood systems. Before we get into the discussion, I want to take some time to introduce our panelists. I'm joined to the left here by Shannon Brown, who's the Children's Services Manager at the United County of Leeds in Grenville. Shannon brings deep experience in both system planning and system delivery, so we're very happy to welcome her. On the far end is Dr. Magdalena Janus, professor in the Department of Pediatrics at the University of British Columbia and affiliated with the Offord Center at McMaster. And it's actually Magdalena's work that inspired this panel, so we are very happy to welcome her here today. And in the middle, we're joined by Nicola, Lyle, who's the CEO of the Peterborough Child and Family Centers, who brings valuable perspective from community-based family support and integrated service delivery settings. So we are also very pleased that she can join us. So welcome, everybody. Before we begin, I want to set the stage just a tiny bit. So this panel is really about helping us think more clearly about how bias shows up, both within professional practice, but then across systems. So to help ground us in both the research and the systems context, we're going to begin with two short framing presentations. First, Magdalena is going to walk us through the research and what the research tells us about bias in early childhood settings. And then Shannon is going to build on this by situating the discussion within the early childhood system, more specifically through the Ontario system lens, helping us to think about the different levels of the system and how they exert influence. So with that said, I'm going to call on Magdalena.
Well, thank you very much, Daniel, for this introduction on behalf of all of us. Even though I'm now in Vancouver, I am very recent transplant, so I spent over 30 years here in Ontario, and it's always wonderful to come back and see all the friends here. So in the few minutes, I just kind of wanted to start, well, speaking of friends, here's Rob. Hi, Rob. I don't have to convince you. I'm speaking to people who kind of live and breathe this issue, but children do not develop in a vacuum. So quite often in research, we situate children in the middle of this kind of series of concentric circles. And I think what I would like to just remind everyone that early childhood education, early childhood learning and care is very much this kind of in a second layer surrounding a child beyond the child's family. And they play such a crucial, important role in child development. So that model is really useful because children's experiences and what they and stimulation they receive or do not receive in their early environments, including neighborhoods, family conditions, institutional quality, and public policy as well, matter a lot. Okay. But, the main thrust of conversation right now is that we want to, the world is not colorblind. So much as we want to say every child is equal, every family is the same, they are not. And, from my perspective, from the perspective that I've learned, where I started my academic career as a primatologist, evolutionary biologist, human evolution really reinforced preferring those who look like us, who are like us. And unfortunately, humans have taken that to another level. And that's part of the social development that we faced in the kind of development of sentient humankind. Bias is there, but it's harmful when it's acted upon. And unfortunately, bias can influence how children develop and what they experience, how they are perceived. So we've worked in the small study that Daniel referred to. We were looking at understanding educators' perceptions and interpretations of children's behaviors and we heard that from educators, that they are influenced not only by the child's identity, but also by their own identity, by their own experiences in the classroom. Right. So, as I mentioned, bias is inherent in systems, design, and history. And quite often, individual interactions are really not quite enough to overcome that. because it's not shaped just by individuals, but it's also shaped by tools that we use for evaluation, for assessment. They could have inappropriate questions, or they may have not have enough questions that could really assess the full developmental spectrum of a child, for spectrum of abilities. So some of the things that we do could magnify the bias. Then we quite often, and I think in Canada, we're really very guilty of ignoring demographics at our peril. We pretend that there is no racism in assessment in the systems. Like we beginning to uncover that a little bit more now. But if, just look around yourself, how many data sets there are around children's education and learning that would actually look at children based by race. And I know race is a social construct, but it's a construct that really influences children's chances to succeed in life. So there is this problem that, there's no data about discrimination, and therefore there is no action. And obviously child development could also can be biased towards, depending on which school is in which environment, people quite often very loosely drop, conversation about schools in disadvantaged areas, and they quite often can perceive a child as being something because they are part of that school community. And also advisories and trustees can be can have people who do not even realize their own implicit bias and therefore influence policies and action. So even though educators do quite a lot to mitigate their bias, this is really quite uneven because they have to rely on informal strategies. And the fact that somebody is individually aware doesn't eliminate the structural influence. And, in our conversations, we know that they kind of constantly, the ones that are really aware and really want to make a difference, they constantly check with each other, check within themselves what's happening. But the Know Our Numbers study showed that there aren't enough performance reviews, that only about just under 50% of educators receive anti-bias or anti-racism training. And their professional development in land-based and Afrocentric ways of being is really not adequately delivered. So on top of that, we have wage disparities, which predominantly affect racialized workforce. But just not to end my short presentation on a negative note, a qualitative research that I'm part of, that's led by Dr. Jessie Lee McIsaac at Nova Scotia, shows that one teacher can make a huge difference. So as I mentioned, we know that educators really actively question their assumptions, and many express, as the study led from here showed, interest in receiving more professional training, and that the cultural representation matters. But let's be honest, we'll never have enough Indigenous teachers, early childhood educators in classrooms. We'll never have a representation of every possible cultural and ethnic group, which is why the cultural and social competency training should be integrated for all educators at any level and starting from early childhood education in order for them to gain necessary skills. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. This is a two-dimensional representation of a system. The word system is something that I hear a lot, and you likely hear a lot. My hope today is to further define what the childcare and earlier system is, because we all work in it, whether you're in academia or you're in policy or you're an early childhood educator or you're in government. The childcare and earlier system is something that we work within, but I don't know that we all think about it a whole lot. I'm going to move out here so I can see my slide. This is a really simplified version of a system. And we tried to animate. Look at that. Because the system contracts and it flexes in result of change, right? External changes, internal changes. And it has lots of stakeholders. So in an effort to try to represent what I believe to be one of the most complex systems in Canada, because I'm a bit of a visual thinker and looking for some tangible examples. I remember that when my children were really little, they had this toy that got bigger and smaller. And so I headed over to the dollar store to find what I think represents the complexity of the childcare and early years system. This system is extremely fragile. And I can tell you that this toy is actually very fragile because it traveled with me from Brockville, and I walked it over here in my hand and drew lots of attention. Each one of these nodes represents a stakeholder or an influence on the system. Academia, policy, government, economics, employment, industry, all of those stakeholders, all of those partners are influenced and are part of the system. And when we're talking about biases, do we see this as an education system, a service system, a care system? Because the biases that you hold about this system influence how you interact with this system, how you fund this system, the policies that you put in place for this system, how you behave as a professor when you're teaching about this system, your pedagogy, and how you behave as an educator. And the fragility of this system, changes in policy, implementation of CWELC, changes in legislation, changes in perception, mean that the system moves. It's a very dynamic, complex system. And pressures on the system, positive and negative, cause it to flex. Change is good. Change is not a terrible thing, but it impacts the system. And too much pressure in the wrong way, because we want balance, will break the system. And so if you imagine who is at the center of this system and the role that you hold today, is it the child? Is it the family? Is it the educator? Is it the elected official? Is it the policy? What is at the center of this system? And if it breaks, if it is so fragile and impacted by change, and a piece of this opens, what you hold at the center of this comes out. We have not done the job that I think we're all here to do, regardless of province or territory or role or focus. We all want this to be the highest quality childcare and earlier system for the children that I see in the middle of this complex system. And those biases are present in every one of those connections in policy and government and educators. And they can align or they can work in opposition, but they have significant influence as to what comes next. And the biases that we see in the classroom are downstream biases of all of this. The success of that vision of high quality early learning and childcare is finding a way for all of this complexity to move in the same direction. Similarly, at the same time, but we are all starting at a different spot in our programs, in our practice, in our province, in our territory, but moving in the same direction and understanding that each one of these stakeholders plays an integral role to the success, finding ways to partner, finding ways to communicate, finding ways to be in the same room, finding ways to bridge the divide between care and education. Because I was really reflecting on what we heard in our keynote, and how the bias that I see most predominantly in my role is that what happens from 0 to 6 is care. And what happens from 6, kindergarten, to grade 12 is education. And what frames the education, the before and after school program, is care. That bias inherently changes the way that we teach pedagogy, the way that we fund programs, the way that we value the people that work in the system. Because the care perspective is very much rooted in women's work, and at times, most often, is viewed as not needing a high IQ, a high experience, a high education. We need to get to a place where care and education are part of the 0 to 18 thought process, are part of that system, because that values the role that both early childhood educators play and teachers play, and not only brain development and literacy and math and all of those skills, but also the fact that the teachers in a school are providing just as much care for those students as the early childhood educators are in a toddler program or a preschool program.
Oh, fantastic. Okay, so this is how this is going to work. We're going to do some questions with the panel right now. But at the end, we've carved out a bit of time for some questions. So as you're listening to this conversation, think about some questions that you have that you might want to ask some of our panelists here. So I know you touched on this in your presentation, but we have a wide range of perspectives here. So I want to ask this question. When we talk about bias in early childhood systems, what does that mean to you? And where do you most often see bias showing up, in whether it be daily interactions, assessment tools, the way systems are designed? And I think it makes sense to start with you, Shannon, on this, and then we'll move down the panel.
So being in the role of a service system manager in Ontario affords me the opportunity of proximity to what's actually happening on the ground and the perspectives of the staff working in the program. But it also allows me to have elevation to engage with the Ministry of Education on policy development. So that's a big gap between what's happening at the governmental decision level and what is known and understood in the program room. And there's a lot of barriers to that knowledge and understanding. It's not trickling down into the classroom. So understanding why there's change, understanding how policy is affecting practice, it's not prolific in the classroom. And I think, CWAP, Canada-wide, is a very publicly, I would say publicly known entity in that you turn on the news and you hear about $10 a day childcare, or you hear about CWAP, or you hear about affordability. But what that looks like in the classroom is not enough workforce, maybe not having early childhood educators being in the program who have that foundation of early learning and childcare and brain development and early literacy and all of those important things that you learn as an early childhood educator. And so on the ground, they're navigating today. They're navigating getting through the day sometimes, and also navigating not a workforce that is coming with that same background and understanding and being able to reflect on the biases.
Yeah, so I think for me, and like Shannon, I'm Ontario-based. I'm primarily local, but I do work regionally and provincially too. Despite the fact that I'm kind of on the front line, I think this is primarily a higher level systems issue that then filters down to everyday practice. We have just enormous system pressures that don't allow for practices that might mitigate that bias. And we also have a level of scarcity, real, some perceived, that I think results likely and sometimes unintentionally in bias and discrimination. So I think, our keynote, Rita spoke to it. If we're really invested in addressing bias in early childhood systems, we have to address the hierarchies that are existing in education as a whole, where we have K-12 as the default, and the funding and practices reflect that. And as Rita said, things aren't great in K-12, and we certainly know that in Ontario too. But there are policies and practices in place that do mitigate some of the issues that we face in early learning due to the even greater scarcity of resources. And I certainly don't want to see a race to the bottom. And the cultural belief that, you just spoke to, that early learning isn't really education yet. And so, we don't have enough spaces for all of the children that are eligible to be educated. And we know that disproportionately affects racialized children and children who face other barriers. If you haven't read the Know Your Numbers paper, it's really good. The discrepancies between compensation, and that doesn't just mean pay, it means benefits, it means pensions, they're glaring. I looked a little bit at other provinces, but they seem to be particularly glaring in Ontario. And we have a sector that, as you said, it's predominantly women, and racialized staff make up a much larger proportion of our workforce than the workforce in general, and we should be proud of that. We should own that, but we cannot be exploiting that workforce. And the abundance of for-profit licensed care. We don't have that in the K-12 system. Even private schools are not typically for-profit. That is very rare. Yeah.
Nicola, you talked about the downward pressures, the bias coming at that system level and then affecting educators on the ground. I'm just wondering from your perspective, can you talk about some real world examples from your perspective about how that shows up in the classroom setting or on the ground?
Well, I think right now, so my organization primarily provides early on, which for those of you that are out of province is family support. We do also offer licensed childcare. That's a smaller part of what we do. So we're literally within this scarce system right now. We have a wage floor for some of our educators, and we're funded for that. And we don't for other educators that have the same credentials and education. So we're working really hard to not have a wage gap within our own small staff group. But think about how that starts to play out in the classroom.
Magdalena.
Yes. So first of all, if I may just add, speaking about being nervous, I forgot to say that the work that you referred to was done in collaboration with my colleague, Dr. Natalie Spadafora from Brock University and with Toronto District School Board. So shout out to TDSB. And I think, I don't work in classrooms, but again, what I think these conversations with educators who are in the classroom brought to my mind. In my own research, we're focused on children themselves, but to what extent the well-prepared, very reflexive early educator can influence what's going on in the classroom. And, again, shout out to TDSB because they provide this, provide those who want education and provide the resources to recognize these sources of bias within themselves. And I honestly don't know where the funding comes from and whether they're able to keep this up because the study was done a couple of years ago. But I think the structural support in those ways needs to be present in order to make sure that bias does not happen at the classroom level. So that's all I want to add.
Right. Actually, this leads really nicely into my next question. In your initial presentation, you talked about how difficult it was to turn bias off. And I'm just wondering, what makes certain biases especially difficult for educators to interpret in the early years?
Well, because they are implicit. So I think that's why I'm saying, they kind of making people aware of them is already a huge step. And, look into the depths of your own soul. Without even realizing, you make quick judgments of people, but you don't act on them, I hope. Well, at least that has been my own path in education. As someone who grew up in Eastern Europe, there's way less exposure to people from different cultural groups. And I can see that in some people that come from different parts of the world. And I think making people conscious about what's happening, and it's okay. It's normal. It's part of our human condition. It's what kind of makes you save your children, what makes you kind of like certain people, but you just cannot act on it. And of course, that's not enough, but that's the first step in the classroom.
Right.
Yeah.
Nicola, I'm going to ask you the same question. What makes certain biases especially difficult for educators to interpret in the early years?
Well, I want to build on the professional development piece because I think that is super important. The Know Your Numbers study had some really concerning numbers about how many staff, frontline staff, had access to professional development related to diversity, equity, and inclusion, and it was pretty low. And I think, there are these pockets of funding that come through in early learning, and you get some training, but the problem I think is for that to become part of your practice requires ongoing thought, ongoing learning, ongoing conversations with your peers. And that is typically, if it's done at all, it's after hours, it's unpaid. So, we're kind of the equity issues that are built into this system are part of the barrier of why we run into bias in the classroom with children.
Right. Shannon, and I'll give you an opportunity to respond as well.
Can I say ditto, ditto? When I reflect on another bias that maybe we haven't brought forward that educators are having to navigate in the classroom is the bias that they're facing towards their profession, that they actually may subscribe to. A parent who uses a term like, oh, go see the babysitter, or doesn't want to engage in conversations about concerns about development because they don't see the educator as having any competency to engage in that conversation. And at times, being educators who don't know how to articulate that or may not have the confidence to be able to demystify or correct terminology, perceptions, or statements. Those biases are very difficult to navigate. I have felt those myself as a registered early childhood educator, remembering being a brand new graduate many decades ago and sharing with family members, where I was working. And at that time, I had been hired by a school board to start a brand new program. And I said, oh, I'm working at such and such a school. And, the twinkle in their eye of oh, you're a teacher at the school? Like, that is so great. And I said, no, I'm the early childhood educator. And the response was, like in daycare? That was a visceral response to a career I chose. It wasn't a default career because I couldn't do anything else, right? Is some of the perception that we still navigate today, decades and decades and decades after graduating from that.
That's fantastic. And I actually want to follow up on that for a second, because we had a conversation yesterday about how these same biases, we're talking here about the image of the educator shows up at the governmental level and just how they're portrayed even publicly on websites. So I was hoping you could talk about that for a second.
Sure. Being able to see yourself in public policy, in public documentation is an important part of raising the value of this sector, because we have a value problem, not just a monetary wage value problem, but valuing us for what we bring to the table in expertise. And so, glancing at government websites who have a responsibility for education provincially, territorially, you can often see yourself if you are a teacher in the school system. There's a spot to click on your curriculum, or there might even be a tab that says teacher where you can get other resources. Very rarely is that same tab present for the early childhood educator who may fall under that same portfolio of education. And I was sharing yesterday about my rabbit hole of AI, and I Googled on AI. What images would I use? What language would I use if I wanted to do an EC recruitment campaign? And what I got was your typical, what I see when I Google other things, right? Preschool teacher, not super professional looking, at a brood of children hanging around, and words like kind and caring and loving, all important qualities, don't get me wrong. When I asked the same question of a school teacher, I got an entirely different image and an entirely different skill set. And so this rabbit hole of myself and AI and challenging why these images for this role versus this role, it itself identified that it was representing what people were Googling and looking for, which represents global biases, and seeing the difference between care and education and that divide. There's low-hanging, no-cost fruit that we can start to mobilize to raise the value of the profession so that we can attract a workforce, that we can raise the profile that then will outwardly influence system policy and hopefully funding.
Great. All right, I want to bring it back to the theme of this whole Summer Institute ECEs as change agents, and we've talked a lot today about how these biases are operating on multiple levels of the system. So where do educators have the most influence to disrupt bias beyond their own classroom practice? And we'll start with Nicola on this.
Sure. So I want to acknowledge that, like Shannon's very complicated toy, depending on what we're meaning by the word system, individual educators' ability to disrupt that, can be limited. But I think given the things that we've already talked about today, if you think of system level as kind of anything beyond your own individual classroom work, I think there are opportunities. And Shannon, that language piece is really interesting because, so Shannon's talking about RECEs and teachers. I still hear the word unqualified staff tossed around a fair amount. And when we look at the Know Your Numbers study and we see that there is a greater proportion of racialized staff that are not RECEs, and we start using words like unqualified, what does that mean? Like, what does that say about our workforce? What hierarchies does that create right within our own workplaces? So language is really important. I think another piece that came up for me is, and I can only speak from my community, but wait lists are interesting things, and how we choose who we take from the wait list into our center is complex. And so I would just encourage you to examine that from an equity lens. And are your biases coming in, or your workplace's biases, or your peers' biases coming in when you're making those decisions about who you invite to start at your center? And again, this is not just the individual educator's fault. This is in large part because of an environment of scarcity, but you do have a role in that. And then I think just, how do you work with your colleagues? There was a lot of information in the Know Your Numbers report about workplace discrimination. It was concerning and discouraging. So do you know your organization's policies that allow your peers and yourself to have a voice, to be able to advocate for yourself? The ESA has lots of policies that are the law related to workplace discrimination and harassment. Do you know where to find those? Because they are the law.
Fantastic. Magdalena, will jump.
I just wanted to add and that's from Jesse D. McIsaac's work, and Jeannie Larson at Mount St. Vincent, with conversations with educators and parents as well, that I think there has to be mechanisms for parents to express what they're experiencing. So like their study is doing that, but more on a kind of in community as well, because people often feel isolated if they feel, okay, it's my fault that I've been treated that way. But if, I'm kind of thinking that if somebody doesn't know about it, nothing is going to be, actually this kind of, no data, no problem, no action. Unless we acknowledge that these things are happening and are giving an opportunity for people to tell others about it, there's not going to be any action. So.
Just sort of building on that, because you're talking about it, what sort of structural supports do you think should be in place to support that sort of knowledge dissemination?
That's beyond my pay grade, I'm afraid. I wish I knew, but
yeah.
I think we've already made, like, from the time that I arrived in this country 36 years ago, when started developing a little later the early development instrument, and we wanted to have some demographics there about children's ethnicity, and I was explicitly told there's no racism in Canada, so there's no need for this variable there. Right? You're laughing. I didn't know any better. I was new. Okay, fine. I accept that. But, I think we've gone a long way from that. So to me, that's a huge progress. But implementation, unfortunately, I have no answers.
And Shannon, we'll close off with you.
Can you repeat the question?
Yeah. Where do educators have the most influence to disrupt bias beyond their own classrooms?
I think they have a tremendous opportunity with parents to demystify the profession, to articulate the why of what they do every single day. Why did we go outside when the raindrops were falling? What is the learning when we're doing that? Why am I suggesting your child might need some additional language supports? Because this is what I've heard when I've been interacting. Building a different perception of the system, the sector, the career, and the role. Because parents are fantastic advocates. And when a group of parents comes together, their voices are often heard more loudly than staff that work in a system, whether it be an education system or in an early learning system. And so, finding their voice, which can be challenging. So, what are the structures that could be put in place? What are the things we could do to support educators just to help them find their voice, is to help them build the confidence. It's to help them, seize the opportunities for conversation at not only drop off and pick up time, but with not-for-profit boards of directors, and when they're out in the community, is to build a different understanding, a more accurate understanding of early learning and childcare, and the roles and the education and the skills and the knowledge that it takes to do this well.
Fantastic. I am aware of the time, and we're coming close to the end, so I want to leave some time for questions here. I'm happy to walk around with the mic, so if you have a question for the panel, just raise your hand and I can bring the mic. At the very top, okay, I'm coming.
Hi, Shannon, I think you nailed it when you said the source bias is that care and education bias. Norway got rid of this by making a political decision not to talk about care and education. Where are we here in Canada, in Ontario, to maybe get rid of that bias as well, to move things forward?
Wow, big question. I think it takes a lot of these stakeholders getting in the same room and helping build understanding and feedback loops. At the governmental policy level, there's not a lot of proximity to what's happening on the ground or the voices or the stories. I benefit as a service system manager from seeing both of those pieces and being able to be in classrooms with educators and hearing these things. And because I came from this system and I have decades of lived experience. How do we translate those stories? How do we share those stories to the policymakers? How do we amplify those voices? Because the proximity to what's happening on the ground in educators is quite a distance at the governmental level, right? At the governmental level, because some of the provinces and territories, Ontario, for example, is huge. Number of educators, enormous. Number of childcare programs, exponential. And so, at the governmental level, it's numbers, right? That's the data that's being used to inform policy. I get to hear the stories. So how do we amplify the stories? How do we challenge some of the narratives? How do we think collectively about change and put the voices that need to be heard in the room with the people that make the decision?
I'm just trying to articulate this in my head as it's coming through. And I appreciate everything that the panel has been speaking about. I'm wondering where not-for-profit organizations is woven in this breakage of the bias thought of the educator. I hear you say the educator should speak to parents. As someone who works with educators also every day, where in that, and I'm sure it's meant to also mean the system itself as not the educator, but the supervisors, the managers, where are they in this picture and how do they get the support or the knowledge to have these dialogues? That's just where my thinking is right now, thinking, yes, I would love all educators to be able to talk to a parent and say, it's taken you 5 years for educators to feel safe enough to say, I'm going outside because. However, how do we already have leaders in place to support that dialogue, I guess, is something.
Yeah, I mean, I think that does come back to to the professional development piece. We really identified that in Peterborough when we did get some professional development funding, that we had loads of new supervisors coming into the system, and yeah, they hadn't had any training in managing. And I think there's this thing that we do where we take really great frontline staff and then we make them supervisors and assume they're going to thrive, and we give them no supports to do that. So to me, that is actually the primary, the number one thing that we need to do to be able to kind of create a better system of that. And I think also with Shannon talking about parents, I think from an equity lens, it's also really important that we think about how do we allow parents to talk to us? What ways do we make available to parents to give us feedback? Do we do that in multiple ways, as well as talking to parents?
If I could just preface, when I said educators talk to parents, I absolutely meant supervisors and executive directors. My lens in Ontario with the implementation of CWALC is the majority of those executive directors spend 8 hours a day doing paperwork because of the administrative burden that this change has placed on the system. And so, you know, while I'm sure they absolutely would love to be the ones having those conversations with parents, the reality is they're completing a survey or a financial report or having to deal with HR issues or a parent complaint or a child who is, you know, just vomited outside the classroom, right? Like that's the reality of early learning in childcare. I absolutely agree with Nicola that those skills to be able to talk with parents, not talk to parents, talk with parents, are skills that we need in our early learning system to hear the voices of parents, because that would inform practice in the program, that would inform policy in that particular program, but then also could be fed up to decision makers, right? Because that voice of parents is equally important.
My brain is going all over the place for the biases. So I'm going to try to narrow it down a little bit, but I'm looking at different categories. We have a multi-service system center that has center-based care, home-based care, and early on. And so within our own agency, we see the biases of what even the team members know of each other and don't know of each other. So we try to address that, but then we try to be transparent and let them know what's happening in the policy world. And then we go to policy, and when you talk about how do we tell those stories, especially when we try to tell those stories by putting them in the email when we put in our data, and they're never read. And you know they're never read because you get an email with a question where the answer was in the email I sent them. So multiple questions there. How do we? On all levels.
So we also directly deliver early on. So I do have some ongoing experience of how do we tell those stories, because we are one of those entities that is subject to annual reporting and data as well, and would love to have the opportunity to provide an anecdotal interpretation of the data that we're sending up. I would say tenacity. And finding as many avenues as you can to share those stories. Be like a, small creek that has found its way through a ravine over time, because, there is only so much capacity, I think, at the governmental level to have the intake of data and then quickly turn it around to make decisions. I think finding partners, I think, and again, my context is only Ontario with a service system manager, like be tenacious in wanting to share those stories. And encourage and invite those people into programs, into places to hear that stories. Don't just wait for them to come to you. because that administrative burden, all the HR responsibilities that I talked about, they're not specific just to the childcare system. We're all doing this with limited resources and want this great thing to happen. I don't know if that answered your question.
Probably adding more questions.
I think the other thing I would say is, as a multi-service provider, and we are too, I think it's really time for us to start to tell the story of the inequities within our own systems. Those of us who are trying to patch together early on and childcare and different wage grids, because again, when we put an equity lens on that, how are we to tell our own staff that despite the fact that they have the same credentials and they are doing the same work, we are going to pay them differently?
Hi, can you hear me okay? My name is Kim and I work at the University of Guelph as a pedagogical leader. And I'm going to try to articulate this. I don't know if it's going to come out the way that I'm thinking, but it's a very loose thought. And as we're talking about sharing stories and educators' competencies and how bias shows up in multiple levels of this system, and sort of naming and noticing bias, I just sort of wondered about the idea of having a tool in place already that might help us mobilize some stories. Educators are creating pedagogical documentation, and I wonder about that. It's meant to facilitate and elicit collaborative inquiry, not just in a classroom, but across a learning community and maybe across a whole sector. And so as that thought was forming, I just thought I would put it out there to see how that lands, and maybe, some of the sort of pros and cons of that being a tool to share some stories and bring it to different levels, maybe not as a quantitative approach, but maybe more qualitative.
Well, sure. I think that's fantastic. Glad to hear that from you. And I think there's a combination of ways in which we have to share those stories, because, sharing stories is amplifying the quantitative data, giving meaning to it, giving the nuance, because unfortunately the policies are being turned on numbers. And to some extent, we need those numbers. We need accountability at the very high level. But the numbers are meaningless if there is no story that accompanies it. And I think that's maybe kind of the accountability system should be a little bit different. Like, it's not just kind of the numbers. We need to know our numbers, to borrow a phrase. But at the same time, we need to know what's behind those numbers. And hopefully that will make a difference.
Unfortunately, we've come to the end of our time here. Can we put our hands together for the panel? Thank you to each and every one of them for taking the time to come and speak with us. We are very, very appreciative.